own it one more story today, folks, before we wrap it up. I want to talk a little bit about, there's been a kind of a recent dispute or kerfuffle, whatever word, relating to this thing, a set of regulations inside the Housing Urban Development, HUD, which relate to affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing. To be very clear on the history of this, in the Fair Housing Act, which I think passed like 1968, there were obviously the point of the Fair Housing Act, one of the main points was to end discrimination and redlining, which a lot of controversy exists about how genuine and widespread the redlining was. But there were arguments that there were loans made by banks or lending institutions. There were all sorts of policies in place that were trying to keep America racially segregated. And so the point of the Fair Housing Act was to say, we're going to get after all of this. We're going to get after the fair housing mess, and we're going to try to force these communities that continue to discriminate to stop doing that. So what happened? So this passed back in 1968. All sorts of things happened over the years. But President Obama came along and he put in place regulations, again, referring to it as the affirmative, AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing. The gist of the idea was to tie federal funding that otherwise goes to communities around the country to the community's compliance with new demands made by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. New demands by HUD, forms to fill out, data to study, data to cover, your county, your city, what is the racial composition, where, is it relatively integrated or is it not integrated? What is the density of the population of various races? It was forcing cities to do a massive amount of data collection and computation. It was a lengthy set of things that that had to be answered, all under the guise of the affirmatively furthering fair housing mission. And before I get into the details of that, I want to just tell you a little observation about something. I'm constantly talking about preserving America, preserving the idea of America, and certainly, fighting discrimination based on race is a good and noble and right thing. We did need in our country, we needed to have the civil rights movement. We needed to have the ending of segregation. We needed to have not just the laws that passed, but kind of the new social consciousness in our country that said, we have a great country, but we have a history that has involved segregation, and we want to do everything we can to make a more perfect union, to make America a more unified place in which people of every race, ethnicity, national origin have an equal opportunity to thrive, achieve, dream, to live out their dream. And that was a good and right motive. But back in the time of creating the Great Society, when Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to work on his effort to fight poverty, there was a kind of thinking that evolved. It didn't just start there, but it was very evident in government at that time. In fact, there's a book out, The Great Society by Amity Shlaes, and I haven't read it, but a friend of mine read it and was just commenting about the idea that what you gather from her book, she's talking about how we got around to creating the Great Society programs, which were all of the anti-poverty programs, the welfare and food stamps and housing assistance, all of those packaged together was kind of the Great Society thing. And one conclusion my friend drew from reading Emily Slay's book, which I do want to read, was the idea that, you're sitting in Washington, you have all of these Ivy League educated people, and they're very, very bright, and they're very accomplished. Maybe they're not accomplished, they're very well educated. They have great degrees from great universities, and they're sitting around a big table in the White House and saying, yeah, we got to do something about poverty. Well, let's try this. And so they look at, a map of America, and they see segments where there's poverty, segments where there's wealth. They see whatever numbers they looked at. And these are the grand meisters of the universe sitting in the White House in Washington saying, you know what? We could do this. What if we said, what if we created, and so you had these people in Washington, they have a big pile of cash to spend from tax dollars, big pile of cash of your tax dollars to spend to try to fix inequities and poverty. Inequities, especially based on race, but you know, the Great Society was not uniquely or specifically focused on black versus white. There just happened to be there was a higher level of poverty in some, especially some inner city black communities. And so these people sat in Washington thinking, well, how do we solve this? Okay, well, we're going to, you know, take this pile of money and put it in this program, and then Washington's going to send out this money to this group and send out this money to this group. It was a grand meister, you know, controlling. It was very much like the Soviet Union central planners sitting up there in Washington thinking, oh, I see the problems. I know how you fix it. First, you force this here, and you force this here. So what happened with the Great Society was, of course, and we've talked about many times in our show, among the many things that happened was we created the modern day welfare system. And the modern day welfare system, which we've gone through reforms and more reforms and changes to the law, but the gist of it was you had money coming from Washington to low-income households. And money coming from Washington low-income households was predicated on whether or not there was a wage earner in the household. So to cut to the chase, and we've talked about this in the show before, books have been written, you know, mountains have been written. The Great Society, the creation of the welfare programs, including aid to families with dependent children and SNAP, all the welfare programs, or they called it food stamps then, contributed to and statistically paralleled the breakdown of the nuclear family unit. When you tell people you can get more money from Washington when there isn't a wage earner in the home, you had this just grotesque rise. And again, it wasn't all with black families. The same thing happened in white families, but it was particularly striking and notable in inner city America that you had essentially, to put the equation together, you had the rise of the Great Society and the destruction of the nuclear family unit went hand in hand, cause and effect. And it particularly hit hard black American communities. We've had Star Parker in this show, we've had Alan West on this show, other black conservative activists speaking out against the welfare programs, pointing out that the welfare programs destroyed the black family. You know, the percentage of children born into single parent homes is very high in the black community. It's pretty high in the white community too, but much higher in the black community, and all the things that follow along from single parent households. The increase, in fact, the little clip we played from Marcellus Wiley recently, what he made that point too, because he said he studied it in college at Columbia, how, you know, the likelihood of a young man, especially raised in a single parent household by a mother, likelihood of that young man to end up using drugs, in jail, dropping out of high school, joining a gang, in poverty, every bad thing you'd never want for any human being, all of those things are more likely for a child raised in a single parent household. Point being, I'm going to get back to our story about housing, but the idea of all this was there was observations that you can make with respect to the lack of wisdom, the lack of, how to say it positively. You can conclude that when people sit in Washington with big maps on the table and drawing out numbers and data and stats and putting programs in place, that you don't actually solve the problems, and sometimes you make problems worse. The welfare programs on balance made things worse in terms of the differentiation in poverty didn't change between blacks and white Americans. The poverty programs may have put, you know, food on the table every day, but they didn't lift people out of poverty. And literally, you know, many academicians and politicians have pointed this out. So now I get back to affirmatively furthering fair housing. President Obama, in furtherance of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, put in place extremely stringent things under HUD, essentially requiring HUD, you know, to condition money to cities and counties by saying you don't get the money unless you submit these massive bits of data, massive data collection, and on top of that, the program from Washington became coercive. It became not just you cities that were not happy with the racial breakdown of your communities, we're going to force you, as examples, force you, if you want to get the funding that you need, you must build densely packed multifamily units. you must accept in these in neighborhoods in the suburbs, you must accept multifamily units, which often they certainly bring poorer people in. They often bring crime. They bring destruction or a reduction in property values. They add all sorts of harm to the communities in which they're forced. A really specific example I was reading about this morning had to do with an order out of HUD that related to Dubuque, Iowa. And Dubuque, Iowa, which, I guess I've never been there, but I guess it had a largely white population, and there was a concern about how you had the white population maybe not really as accepting. They didn't know why, but there was not a significant black population. So HUD, to go along with the affirmatively forwarding fair housing, moved individuals who were black Americans, lived in Chicago, in inner city Chicago, moved those people as part of HUD out of inner city Chicago, black Americans, into the community of Dubuque, Iowa. And whether they got along, didn't get along, I don't know. But the point is, this is just like the Soviet Union central planners, just like the people in Washington, sitting there deciding from thousands of miles away, hey, I know what I'll do. We're going to force this people to do this. We're going to force these people to do this. So what happened then, so Obama has this affirmative furthering fair housing. A lot of people did not like it, complained about it. So when Ben Carson came along, Ben Carson now, who is the head of HUD, he basically said, we're gonna pull back from the way Obama was doing this. We're gonna put more power in the hands of local officials who understand better their neighborhoods, their communities. So he's saying we should not be running the show on affirmatively furthering fair housing from Washington, but in fact, we should have the local leaders who know their communities, who know the lay of the land, they know everything about the communities. Let them be the ones more in charge of doing this. So this is the first answer that Ben Carson gave. And he actually had a statement I wanted to read to you. HUD's commitment to fair housing remains as steadfast as ever before, but this improvised rule reaffirms our mission of giving people more affordable housing options in communities across the country. By fixing the old affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, localities now have the flexibility to devise housing plans that fit their unique needs and provide families with more housing choices within their reach. So essentially, we had Ben Carson under President Trump say, we're not going to sit in Washington and shuffle this group of people from one city into somewhere else because we think we know better where they should live. We're going to put power back in the communities. We're still going to make sure that affordable housing is available in more places. We're going to put power back in the hands of the people. Well, the left is apoplectic and has been very, very critical of Ben Carson because they want Washington to just take charge and send out these. And also, Ben Carson, he made many changes. Another one was he pulled back that it was like a 19-page form with I don't know how many questions on it that they had to fill out, assess, and it became, as he said, was confusing. People weren't sure of how to fill it out correctly. They were afraid they'd be punished and get funding cut off if they didn't do exactly what the form was requiring. So it made an ugly mess for local jurisdictions. So now here we are in 2020 election cycle, and you have Joe Biden saying, among the many things he will do, is he's going to reactivate Obama's affirmatively furthering fair housing approach. He is going to have Washington, through HUD, with a very forceful program, getting on top of deciding which jurisdictions have insufficient integration, and it's going to be forced from Washington. He's bragging about that, and I want you to read, if you would like to read lengthy things, Biden has I think it's a 27-page document from his website. It's called The Biden Plan for Investing in Our Communities Through Housing. You can read it and you will understand he very much has the leftist Marxist, we're going to take control, we're going to force these cities and counties, we're going to tell them who's going to live there, we're going to tell them when they're going to have, how they're going to change their zoning. In fact, that was one of the big pieces that was being pushed by the leftists and Biden has agreed to. Biden's been talking with Bernie Sanders about this, they've acknowledged that, is that part of what has to happen in Washington is that Washington has to be the one making changes in zoning. These local zoning officials can't be trusted. You can't just let them make zoning decisions because you want to have, they in Washington want to have the densely packed multifamily housing plunked in the middle of a suburban area that has single-family homes throughout the community. In fact, one of the big pushes of the real extreme Marxists, which Biden and Bernie both are at this point, is the idea, why does anyone get to have a single-family home? Why do we need to have single-family homes? You can find much literature talking directly about that. There's ultimately, it's kind of a bourgeoisie, who are you to think a single-family home is okay? The government will tell you the degree to which we'll have single-family homes. Decisions about zoning will come out of Washington. This is all part of Biden's plan. And so you had Biden bragging about this. You had Trump tweet out yesterday, a couple days ago, saying, a lot of people are asking me to look again at this affirmatively furthering fair housing thing. Doesn't sound right to me. And my caption for this segment, what I want to close by saying is this. The Democrats have been the architects of destruction of much of what was good about America. The Democrats have been the architects of the destruction of the American education system, of what kids learn about America, in schools. They have been the destruction of our borders, the destruction of our national sense of identity and sovereignty and pride in being Americans. And you have to understand, with Biden as president, he will be taking aim at suburbia, at America, the whole idea of people who, are successful, they work hard, they build their way up, they're finally able to afford a home, and they buy it in a safe suburb. And this is Joe Biden saying, you know what, you might think you live in a nice safe suburb out of the crime of inner city, but don't worry, we at HUD in Washington will be sending inner city to your neighborhood. This is what Biden is promising. This is what Trump is saying, not on his watch. We'll have to go more into this because I'm out of time for today, but it's a really important thing, not just to understand specifically the housing issue, but the larger sense of how Biden and Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama and the leftists who run the Democrat Party today, what they think their job is. They think their job is to control everything about America, including housing, including zoning laws, including whether you're allowed to continue having suburbs filled with single-family homes. This is the Marxist mentality I'm trying to get across over and over in so many different segments in the show. Understand, America will drastically change if Joe Biden wins the presidency and you have Democrat control of the House and Senate. You won't recognize your country anymore.